Welcome, everyone. My name is Christy Finefield. I am a reference specialist here in the Prints and Photographs Division of the Library of Congress. Today, we're going to talk about presidential pets. 45 men have served as President of the United States in the last 200 plus years, but hundreds of animals have called the White House home in that same time, as pets and companions to the chief executive and his family. All but 3 presidents in our history have had pets while in office. However, of those 3, President Andrew Johnson did leave food for some mice he found in his bedroom, so we might count that. Today, I'll share the stories of a few dozen of those animals and the people that surrounded them, drawing from the collections of the Prints and Photographs Division. During the presentation, I'll also mention some of the collections I've used, and we'll share links in the chat pointing to more about those collections when I do, so you can explore them yourself on your own. Our earliest presidents had pets such as dogs and birds, but let's talk about their horses. Horses aren't often thought of as pets, but they were beloved animals, hunting companions, military stalwarts, and simply transportation for these early presidents. The first president to live in the White House, John Adams, had a simple brick stable built just off the grounds at the corner of 14th and G in 1800. His carriage horses, Cleopatra and Caesar, resided there along with others. Thomas Jefferson built new stables in 1806, subsequently burned by the British during the War of 1812 when they burned the White House. The stable you see here in this photo from about 1857 or 1858 was in use until it burned down during Lincoln's presidency. This photo was printed just 20 years after the invention of photography. It is showing its age, over 160 years old, in the fading you see, but you can still make out the White House in the background on the right and a horse standing to the left of the stable. When Ulysses S. Grant was elected president, he brought 3 of the horses that had served him well during the U.S. Civil War to the nation's capital, and those horses are seen here, left to right, Egypt, Cincinnati, and Jeff Davis. Nearly all artistic depictions of Grant on horseback are on Cincinnati, the horse in the center. For example, the equestrian statue of Grant that you find on the west side of the U.S. Capitol is of Grant astride Cincinnati. Horsemanship was a family affair, as seen in this 1868 engraving of Grant with his wife and children in front of the White House, where no less than 3 family members are on horseback, including his oldest son, Frederick, on the right in military uniform, and his daughter, Nellie, on her pony in the front. The structure seen here in 1903 during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency and featuring some of his family's many horses was built during Grant's administration and remained in use until it was demolished in 1911, having been converted at that point to a garage by President Taft and used primarily for his automobiles. Mrs. Roosevelt's mare, seen here, was one of the last horses to live in that stable, featured just behind her. This may be Yagenka, reported to be Mrs. Roosevelt's favorite horse to ride. When Benjamin Harrison came to the White House as president in 1889, he already had a family connection to the place, as his grandfather was President William Henry Harrison. Harrison also surrounded himself with family, as not just his wife moved into the White House, but also his 2 adult children and their families. So his 3 grandchildren, Marthena, Mary, and Benjamin Harrison McKee, known as Baby McKee in the press, were common sights around the White House and quickly became media darlings. Naturally, their grandfather doted on them, and one way he did that was by acquiring a goat named Old Whiskers to pull them around the grounds on a cart, as you can see here, with Mary and Baby McKee in the cart and their cousin Marthena standing with her father, Major Russell Harrison, on the grounds of the White House. One day, while the president was waiting for his carriage in the north portico, Old Whiskers ran off with all three grandchildren in the cart and right out the White House gates into the city. President Harrison ran after him, carrying his top hat and cane, trying to get the goat to stop. The runaway goat cart was eventually stopped by helpful Washingtonians after seeing their president's frantic chase into the city. The Harrison grandchildren also enjoyed the company of a dog named Dash and two possums named Mr. Reciprocity and Mr. Protection. The possums were later donated to the zoo. When Teddy Roosevelt's family came to the nation's capital, they brought an array of animals never before seen in the White House. In a letter from 1902, Teddy himself introduced some of them. Quote, "There is Jack, the terrier, and Sailor Boy, the Chesapeake Bay dog, and Eli, the most gorgeous macaw with a bill that I think could bite through boilerplate, who crawls all over Ted and whom I view with dark suspicion, and Jonathan, the piebald rat, a most friendly and affectionate nature, and the flying squirrel and the two kangaroo rats, not to speak of Archie's pony, Algonquin, who is the most absolute pet of them all." End quote. Eli Yale is the blue macaw seen here, and Theodore Jr. was the only one who could handle him and did not retreat in fear. When photographer Francis Benjamin Johnston, seen at right here in 1888, came to the White House to photograph Ted Jr. with the bird, and they had to go to the conservatory as the only safe location to do so. It's also said that this bird's favorite food was coffee grounds. Ms. Johnston was the unofficial court photographer and had access to the White House during Benjamin Harrison, Cleveland, McKinley, and the Theodore Roosevelt administrations. The photo of Harrison's grandchildren in the goat cart was also her work, as were both these photos of two more Roosevelt children with their pets. On the left, we have Alice Roosevelt and her Chihuahua Leo, and Kermit on the right with Jack, a Manchester Terrier. Poor Jack was always terrorized and chased by the cat, Tom Quartz, who unfortunately did not pose for a photo for Miss Johnston or for anyone else that I could find. In this family photo, just one dog makes the cut to be in the photo, and it looks to be Skip, one of President Roosevelt's favorites. Skip was a small, affectionate dog he picked up during a bear hunt in the Grand Canyon. He was a good family pet and used to run races against 7-year-old Archie in the second-floor hall of the White House. Archie would push the dog behind him as the race began, and Skip would scramble on the smooth floors to catch up. There was no word on who usually won, but my money's on Skip. Roosevelt said Skip was a good fighter and stood his ground against a bear. But as you can see, he also enjoyed relaxing lap time with his owner, happily resting while Teddy reads in the doorway of the West Divide Creek Ranch House in Colorado in this 1905 image. We learn about another Roosevelt pet in an article titled "Slippers, the White House Cat" by none other than social reformer, muckraking journalist, and photographer Jacob Riis, published in January 1908 in St. Nicholas, which was a children's periodical. And this article followed a multi-page article called "A Day's Work with the President." The story goes, during a state dinner, Roosevelt was leading the wife of an ambassador from the state dining room to the East Room along the corridor, with a procession of distinguished guests behind them. Suddenly, he stopped, as Slippers was lounging in the middle of the hall, blocking the path. After briefly considering moving the cat, who had no interest in moving himself, likely believing the event was being thrown in his honor, Teddy took a different approach. With an amused bow, President Roosevelt escorted his guest around the cat and proceeded down the hall. Behind him, representatives from Great Britain, France, Italy, and many other nations followed suit, as Slippers, the six-toed cat, purred his contentment. One of the Roosevelt's unusual pets was a one-legged rooster. The Roosevelt children crafted him many crutches and other substitute for his missing leg, but he apparently preferred hopping around the yard on his one good leg instead. Algonquin was Archie's pony, who is seen sitting on him here. Once when he was sick in bed, it is said his brothers Kermit and Quentin brought the pony up to his room in the White House elevator. Depending on the story, the arrival of the pony made Archie feel better immediately, or the pony was quite difficult to get out of the elevator, perhaps both. Legend also says that the pony's hoof marks still mar the floor of the White House. All in all, the Roosevelt family had about 36 pets of various shapes and sizes during their time in the White House. President William Howard Taft's contribution to presidential pet lore came in the form of 2 cows, with the most famous being a 1,500-pound Holstein from Wisconsin. Taft initially brought his own cow, Mooly Wooly, to assure himself and his family a steady supply of milk. After she died in 1910, Wisconsin Senator Isaac Stevenson contacted his stock farm and said to pick out the best bred cow in the herd and ship it to Washington for President Taft. And so purebred Holstein Pauline Wayne became the newest resident of the White House grounds, grazing the lawns and reportedly producing 16 gallons a day of milk for the first family. She arrived pregnant and soon gave birth to Big Bill, named in honor of President Taft. The calf was sent to live on a Maryland farm. Pauline was a media sensation, and her near-death experience captured a lot of attention. Pauline was invited to be the star of the 1911 International Dairymen's Exposition in Milwaukee, where little bottles of her famous milk sold as souvenirs for 50 cents. Her private train car accidentally ended up at the Chicago stockyards, but she was rescued in the nick of time. During this time, the dairy show people, the president's household, and the Stevenson farm, where she was to stay until the show, were telegraphing all over the country looking for her. The Tafts thought of Pauline as a beloved family pet and declined any further invitations for her to leave the White House after that. Pauline was the last cow to live at and provide fresh milk to the White House. During Woodrow Wilson's second term as president, as the country was engaged in World War I overseas, he decided to add some new animals to the White House property. The Wilson White House had been relatively light on pets, though counted among them was a cat named Puffins. Cats are notoriously camera shy, it seems, or perhaps it's simply that the cats enjoyed the indoors, where news photographers did not get a chance to snap them. In April 1918, Wilson decided to purchase a small flock of sheep to graze the White House lawn. He got them from a farm in Bowie, Maryland, on the advice of White House physician Dr. Grayson. The flock began as 12 sheep and 4 lambs. One reason for the addition of the sheep was to reduce the costs of groundskeeping of the White House during the war. In January 1920, a thoroughbred Shropshire ram named Ike was added to lead the flock, a gift from a Pacific Coast ranchman named W.S. Guilford. Ike turned out to have a penchant for chewing tobacco, a habit he kept his entire life. By May 1920, the flock had grown to 48, with 21 of them being lambs born that spring, like these 2 in the photo. Here we see the nearly 180 pounds of wool sheared from the White House flock in June 1920 and donated to the Salvation Army to be auctioned to raise money for relief efforts. In 1919, the wool had been donated to the Red Cross for the same purpose. When Wilson left the White House, the large flock of sheep and Ike moved to the Maryland farm of L.C. Probert. Old Ike died of old age there, his flock having grown to 75 when he passed. While a number of pets who lived at the White House have been popular with the American public, Laddie Boy set a new standard, becoming truly a pioneer in the role of the first dog. The affable Airedale joined President Harding and his First Lady as a 6-month-old puppy, arriving at the White House on March 5th, 1921, the day after Harding's inauguration. He was born at Caswell Kennels in Toledo, Ohio, and was a gift to the president. The Hardings had no children, and they doted on Laddie like their own. He was an instant celebrity, his every move garnering a headline, as I'll share in some upcoming slides with just a few of his mentions in the press. Laddie had his own hand-carved chair to sit in during cabinet meetings, as seen here. Whether he shared any opinions during the meetings is unknown, but he did give an interview published in the Washington Star that purported to share his opinion on everything from Wilson sheep to prohibition to his support of 8-hour workdays for guard dogs. You can see a photographer coming in close to get a good shot of Laddie in the chair in this photo. This is a good moment to talk a bit about the photos you'll see as we explore Washington, D.C. in the early to mid-20th century. Many of the photos will come from the Harrison Ewing collection and the National Photo Company collection, both of which were news photo services that provided photos to publications such as newspapers. The Hardings were ardent supporters of the humane treatment of animals, and Laddie did his part. Here he is as the Grand Marshal at the head of the Be Kind to Animals parade, held by the Humane Education Society in May 1921 in Washington, D.C. A man named Wilson Jackson, formerly a messenger at the White House, had been given the unofficial title of Master of Hounds in the Harding White House. He can be seen standing just to Laddie's left here and appears in many other photos of Laddie as well. The President and First Lady observed the parade, and newspaper reports say Laddie barked a greeting as the float passed. Laddie also helped Florence Harding with her hosting duties. Here he poses with Mrs. Harding for a visiting group of Girl Scouts from Orange, New Jersey. If you look closely, you can see that a number of the girls are taking a photo of Laddie and the First Lady with their own cameras. On July 20th, 1922, Laddie Boy's father, champion Tin Turn Tip Top, sent his son a cake and a letter to commemorate his 3rd birthday coming up on July 28th. As you can see here, the cake was made of dog biscuits and complete with a sign that reads, Laddie Boy's birthday cake, 3 years of age. Laddie posed for several photos for the press with his cake, such as this one, and he was always a cooperative subject. The cake and birthday festivities were covered in the news, of course. Laddie finally gets to take a taste of the cake here. The letter from his father goes on to say, quote, "It's hard to realize what a famous family member we have in you. If we did not see your pictures in the newspapers and magazines, it would be hard for us to realize that you have grown to doghood and are no longer the roistering young blade that we bade goodbye to long ago." End quote. Along with the letter, Laddie Boy's father sent snapshots of his entire family. Laddie Boy hosted the annual White House Easter egg roll in April 1923, when both of the Hardings were absent. A happy Laddie grins here, surrounded by children, with the ever-present Mr. Jackson at his side. When the Hardings returned from a 5-week vacation a week later, Laddie Boy welcomed them home, leaping, barking, yelping, and jumping on them, both as they arrived at the White House. Even the happy dog's welcome of his owners was covered in the newspaper, described in detail in the April 9th Washington Post. Sadly, President Harding died in August 1923 while on a trip with the First Lady. In honor of the former newspaperman Harding, the Newsboy Association decided to present Mrs. Harding with a remembrance in the form of a sculpture of Laddie Boy. Laddie Boy did 15 sittings for well-known sculptor Bashka Payev, seen here on the right. Over 19,000 newsboys across the country donated 1 penny each, and these were melted down to cast the life-size sculpture of Laddie Boy. Unfortunately, Mrs. Harding herself passed on before she could receive the statue, and it instead went to the Smithsonian, where it was on display for many years. It is now part of the collection of the Smithsonian Museum of American History. On the left, we have a detail of the small model Payev was working on in the previous photo, as well as on the right, an image of the finished work in the August 1926 Washington Evening Star. Laddie Boy lived out his life with one of the Harding Secret Service agents, Harry Barker. His death notice appeared in the New York Times in 1929, where he was referred to as, quote, first dog of the land. In a sneak peek of the wide variety of unusual animals that will call the White House home in the upcoming Coolidge administration, the Harding's White House also had a pet squirrel named Pete, who, based on these photos, had visitors including members of the cabinet, such as Secretary of the Navy Denby on the left, feeding him by hand and mouth. No president since Teddy Roosevelt had such a menagerie of animals at the White House until Calvin Coolidge and First Lady Grace Coolidge moved in. Let's start with an animal that has become well known in some circles, Rebecca the raccoon. She was given to the Coolidge family in 1926 by a supporter from Mississippi with the intention that she become the Coolidge's Thanksgiving dinner. Instead, they fell in love with her and adopted Rebecca as a pet. That Christmas, President Calvin Coolidge gave her an embroidered collar with the title White House Raccoon, her nickname in the press. The Coolidges had a wooden house built for Rebecca on the White House grounds with a panel that flipped up so she could climb in and out on her own. Rebecca, like Laddie Boy, helped host the annual White House Easter egg roll. On April 18, 1927, the First Lady brought Rebecca to meet the children visiting for the event. She held Rebecca close to her chest and occasionally set her down so the children could pet the raccoon. Rebecca remained on a short leash, as she had developed a reputation for evading staffers and climbing trees to avoid capture. She always returned to her specially built home after she had her fun. Rebecca hosted the White House egg roll once again in 1928. Rebecca was even included on a family vacation in the Black Hills of South Dakota. In addition to their 2 white collies and the First Lady's 5 canaries, the White House raccoon came along. The Coolidges also had their fair share of more traditional pets, with nearly a dozen dogs living at the White House during their stay. President Coolidge had strong feelings about his canine friends, saying, quote, any man who does not like dogs and want them about does not deserve to be in the White House, end quote. The president's favorite was Rob Roy, a white collie seen here helping the Coolidges greet guests on the porch of the White House. He originally came from Island White Kennels in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. A perhaps slightly bored Rob Roy is featured here with the Coolidges on the White House lawn. Like many pets that came into the Coolidge household, he was renamed, as he was originally called Oshkosh. For example, Laddie Boy's half-brother also lived with the Coolidges and was named Laddie Buck. Very quickly, Mrs. Coolidge renamed him Paul Pry, as she said he had his nose in everyone's business. Rob Roy picked up where Laddie Boy left off as far as the legacy of first dogs, accompanying the president everywhere, including to important meetings and to greet visitors to the White House. Rob Roy posed with Mrs. Coolidge for a painting by famed American artist Howard Chandler Christie in 1924. It hangs in the White House China Room, as you can see in this photo from the Historic American Building Survey from sometime between 1985 and 1992. Another white collie joined the Coolidge family in October 1925. Prudence Prim was 1 year old when she arrived at the White House. She had her very own calling card, and as you can see here, was the pet of Mrs. Coolidge, who made her a straw hat bedecked with flowers that Prudence would wear at garden parties. The Coolidges also had cats, and to my delight, there are actually photos of them. The October 22nd, 1923 edition of the New York Tribune read, "The newest arrivals at the White House, introducing Blackie and Tige, two friendly kittens recently received by the President and Mrs. Coolidge. Peter Pan and Laddie Buck, the President's wire-haired terrier, and Airedale, respectively, have refused to be quoted concerning the latest additions to the White House Zoo." Tiger turned out to be a wanderer and disappeared from the White House during a March snowstorm in 1924. When Tige had been missing for a few days, the Coolidges became worried enough to enlist the public's help in finding their pet and turned to radio stations WCAP in Washington, D.C. and WEAF in New York. The March 25th, 1924 New York Times reported, quote, "James Haley, a Secret Service man attached directly to the White House, talked into the radio and the country was notified that the White House tomcat had left home and was wanted back by the president's household," end quote. The article mentioned the immediate influx of phone calls to the White House after the broadcast, most of them offering a replacement cat. The column ended with, quote, "There may be 100 cats at the White House by tomorrow morning," end quote. Luckily, the radio broadcast did the trick, and there was just one more cat at the White House the next morning, Tige. During the snowstorm, Tige had wandered into the new Navy building, half a mile from the executive offices, and decided to stay after being fed by friendly staff. After the radio broadcast, Tige was spotted by a guard in the Navy building the next day and immediately returned to the White House. Here is Tige with Benjamin Fink, the guard who spotted and returned him. I do wonder if Secret Service agent James Haley, pictured here at far right guarding Mrs. Coolidge, ever expected his duties to include putting out an APB for a missing tomcat. The other kitten who was sharing the basket with Tiger was named Blackie, and Blackie preferred indoor adventures. Blackie loved to ride in the White House elevator, and after waiting for someone to open the door, would happily lounge on the padded seat inside for hours. The Coolidges received gifts of many, many other animals, including a goose, a bobcat, lion cubs from South Africa, a wallaby, a black bear from Mexico, a small antelope, Peking ducks, and perhaps one of the most famous, a pygmy hippo given the full name of William Johnson Hippopotamus, Billy for short. A gift of Harvey Firestone of the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, The baby pygmy hippo had been displaced from his home in Liberia by one of the company's rubber plantations. The baby hippo would go, like most of the other exotic animals sent to them, to the Rock Creek Zoo, now the National Zoo. The Coolidges visited often to check on the welfare of the animals they donated. Billy drew a lot of media attention, akin to the giant pandas today, as pygmy hippos were extremely rare in the United States. Over his lifetime, Billy sired 18 calves. As they grew, the calves, all named Gumdrop with Roman numerals to indicate their order of birth, were sent to zoos all over the country. When he died in 1955, Billy was one of the most famous animals in America. His descendants continued to live at the National Zoo into the 2010s. His greatest legacy, though, is as the grandfather of American pygmy hippos. The majority of pygmy hippopotamuses in American zoos can trace their lineage to him. This photo is from the right time period, but it is unidentified. It could be Billy or possibly one of his mates with one of their offspring at the zoo. The mayor of Johannesburg, South Africa, sent these 2 lion cubs to Coolidge as a gift. The president considered keeping them on the grounds of the White House in a specially built cage, but they were already bigger than expected on arrival, and so thankfully, off they went to the zoo as well. When Herbert Hoover, who had never held public office, was running for president, the serious and austere man needed help reaching voters. This heartwarming photo of him with his Belgian police dog, King Tut, was just the ticket. Thousands of autographed copies of this smiling Hoover and his beloved pet were circulated to potential voters. It worked. King Tut moved with the Hoovers to the White House and immediately went to work, patrolling the White House grounds and checking in at the police sentry boxes. He is shown here with W.S. Newton of the White House Police during his rounds. President Hoover also had a lot of dogs during his time in the White House, in addition to King Tut. There were, to name a few, Big Boy, a fox terrier, Patrick, an Irish wolfhound, and one of 3 of these massive dogs the Hoovers had at various times, Ouija, a Norwegian elk hound, Yukon, a husky, and more, including these 2 dogs. Whoopi is on the left and was a Schnauzer, and on the right, one of my favorite dog names in the White House history, Engelhurst Gillette, a Gordon setter and a prize winner at the Madison Square Garden Dog Show. He was presented to Hoover by Colonel William J. Donovan on Inauguration Day. When I came across this photo of a Schnauzer puppy named Piney, it was his perch that caught my attention, as the caption read that these were the famous medicine balls used by the president each morning on the White House lawn. Well, I had never heard of these famous medicine balls, so I looked further and learned of a game called Hoover Ball. White House physician Admiral Joel T. Boone invented the game to keep President Hoover physically fit. The sport was without a name until New York Times Magazine reporter William Dupuy christened the game Hoover Ball for his 1931 article, At the White House at 7 a.m. Hoover Ball was played by teams of 2 to 4 players with a 6-pound medicine ball over a net 8 feet high on a court similar to one used for tennis. The game was scored exactly like tennis and played in a similar fashion. The server threw the ball, the opponent had to catch it and immediately return it. The side that missed the ball or threw it out of bounds lost the point. Early each morning at 7 a.m., between 4 and 18 VIPs would show up for the games on the south lawn of the White House. The participants soon became known as the Medicine Ball Cabinet, though not all were official cabinet members. Like the Coolidges before him, Hoover didn't mind an unusual pet. In May 1929, a possum found its way onto the White House grounds. and was adopted by President and Mrs. Hoover. It lived outdoors in White House accommodations, originally used by Rebecca, the pet raccoon of the Coolidges. Coincidentally, the Hyattsville, Maryland High School Athletic Association had recently lost Billy, their possum mascot. Hyattsville students believed the possum at the White House could be theirs. After a visit to the White House, though, they were disappointed to discover the possum would not come to them when they called, so it was probably not their mascot. Hoover let them borrow the possum for good luck, and after a successful season, he was safely returned to the White House. As we leave the time period covered by the two collections I mentioned earlier, Harrison Ewing and the National Photo Company, one collection I can turn to for photos of presidents and their activities is the New York World Telegram and Sun newspaper photograph collection. Unlike with the previous two collections, many photos in this archive of about 1 million images are not yet digitized. They also tend to have more complex right statuses, as they were collected from many sources for use in the newspaper. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a horseman, like his distant cousin Teddy Roosevelt. In the photo here at far left, a 28-year-old FDR stands alongside his mount in a society paper chase in 1920. The second photo at right is after FDR contracted polio, and it was taken during his campaign for the presidency. And at the bottom, the Roosevelt family boarded their horses at Fort Myer, Virginia. And in 1934, they were looked after there by Corporal George G. Carnahan. From left to right, we have Dot, Mrs. Roosevelt's mount, Pal O' Mine and Patches, the horses of John Roosevelt, and lastly, New Deal, who, as you might expect, was President Roosevelt's horse. When you hear the name FDR, you probably think of one of the most famous presidential pets of all, Fala. In 1940, his cousin Margaret Suckley gave the Scottish Terrier to FDR, and they became nearly inseparable. Fala was originally named Big Boy, but was renamed Murray, the Outlaw of Fala Hill, after one of FDR's Scottish ancestors. Here we see Fala perched in the front seat of the presidential car as he joined the president on a 50-mile tour of New York City in 1944. And on the right, having a walk with the former First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, in New York after FDR had passed. A few facts about little Fala. He witnessed the signing of the Atlantic Charter aboard the USS Augusta in 1941 at the feet of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and FDR. He also became the shipboard pal of both Churchill and his poodle, Rufus. FDR's political opponents concocted a story saying that Roosevelt sent a destroyer back to pick Fala up when he was left behind in the Aleutian Islands, and that the cost was charged to American taxpayers. This story was untrue. FDR addressed the issue in one of his famous fireside chats, saying his opponents, quote, have not been content with a tax on me, my wife, or my sons. No, not content with that, they now include my little dog Fala. Well, of course, I don't resent a tax, and my family don't resent a tax, but Fala does, end quote. FDR trained Fala to shake hands, to greet dignitaries, and to stand at attention on his hind legs during the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner. And on trips, the Secret Service nicknamed him the Informer because the Scotty's presence was a tip-off the president was nearby. After FDR died in 1945, loyal Fala rode beside the First Lady in FDR's funeral cortege and was later buried beside him in the Rose Garden at the Roosevelt Estate in Hyde Park, New York. He was also immortalized in the FDR Memorial built in 1997 in Washington, D.C., as seen here. Not all presidents were big on having pets. One such man was Harry S. Truman. On the left, we have two photos of a rather exhausted-looking Cocker Spaniel puppy named Feller. Feller was an unannounced gift from a woman in Missouri before Christmas 1947 and was shipped to the White House for President Truman. The president did not keep the puppy, but instead gave him to White House physician Brigadier General Wallace Graham. On the right, we have first daughter Margaret Truman taking her Irish setter puppy, Mike, for a stroll over White House grounds. Mike was a gift of Postmaster General Robert Hannigan in 1945, not long after Truman took office. Poor Mike developed rickets from being fed scraps and was sent to live on a farm in Virginia where they thought he would be happier. Curiously, despite relatively little firsthand experience with them, Margaret wrote a book in 1969 on the subject of White House pets, seen here. When the Kennedys arrived at the White House, they brought quite a few animals as well, and the pets became celebrities in their own right. Here we have photos that detail the story of two of the more famous residents. In the upper left, we have two of the Kennedy dogs, Charlie, the Welsh Terrier belonging to 5-year-old Caroline Kennedy, and then we have Pushinka, whose name was Russian for fluffy and had been a gift from Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Pushinka was the daughter of Strelka, the famous Russian dog that had spent a day in space in 1960. When Pushinka became pregnant and had puppies by Charlie in the summer of 1963, the president referred to them as pupniks, and they were named Butterfly, Streaker, White Tips, and Blackie. Over 5,000 letters came to the White House asking for one of the puppies, and 2 were chosen by Mrs. Kennedy. At bottom right, we see one of the lucky recipients, 10-year-old Mark Bruce of Columbia, Maryland, with Streaker. Butterfly went to live with Karen House, also 10, of Westchester, Illinois. The Kennedys also owned the most beloved White House pony since Roosevelt's Algonquin. This pony was named Macaroni, a pony given to Caroline Kennedy by Lyndon Baines Johnson. Macaroni usually lived at the Kennedy's estate in Virginia, but was often brought to the White House with other Kennedy horses for rides and to roam the grounds. President Johnson was a dog lover and especially loved beagles. He courted scandal when he was photographed picking his beagles, him and her, up by their ears into a standing position, eliciting barks and yelps. These 2 were his constant companions in the White House. They rode in the presidential limo, flew to Camp David on the helicopter, were included in receptions for visiting heads of state, and had the run of the White House and grounds. Him was even taken into the reviewing stand for the inaugural parade, the first dog known to have been given such a role. In the photos here, President Johnson bends down to pet one of the beagles during a stroll on the White House grounds, and in the other, an Easter snowstorm forced the cancellation of the White House Easter egg roll. But the beagles seemed pretty content to have the lawn all to themselves. The photo here at far left is captioned, quote, "Despite the fact that their master occasionally pulls on their ears, President Johnson's famous beagles, him and her, are supporting him in the November 3rd election." The White House released this photo showing the dogs on the White House lawn wearing LBJ campaign buttons. The other 2 photos showed what goodwill ambassadors him and her could be, as well as companions to the president. At top right, Johnson is introducing the beagles to children's news correspondents and photographers after a news conference. And on the bottom, we see Johnson during a 15-lap walk around the White House lawn with reporters, with him and her leading the way. During the 1952 campaign, when Nixon was the vice presidential candidate to Eisenhower, there was controversy around a fund contributed to by supporters to pay for Nixon's political expenses. In a speech to address the accusations of wrongdoing, Nixon's new family pet saved the day as part of what has come to be known as the Checker speech. After talking about how the monetary contributions had been used for legitimate expenses and that he did not keep the money, Nixon went on to talk about a gift he received from a man in Texas. He said, Quote, "And believe it or not, the day before we left on this campaign trip, we got a message from Union Station in Baltimore saying they had a package for us. We went down to get it. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas, black and white spotted. And our little girl, Trisha, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it." When Nixon became president, two dogs joined the family in the White House: Pasha, a Yorkshire Terrier, and Vicky, a miniature poodle. In January 1969, Pasha and Vicky welcomed King Timoho, an Irish setter named after a village in Ireland from where Nixon's ancestors hailed, to the White House. King Timoho, or Tim for short, was a bit too much for Pasha and Vicky at first, but eventually they became fast friends. This photo comes from another collection in the Prints and Photographs division, the U.S. News and World Report magazine photo collection. Photos from 1952 to 1986 document local, national, and international politics, with a particular focus on DC and the US. Selections from the 1.2 million photos have been scanned, such as this one, and can be viewed online. Socks was the first cat to catch the nation's attention in decades as the only official White House pet when President Bill Clinton first took office. Here he is in his official White House photo, posing on the lawn. And here we have a contact sheet from the Roll Call collection, a collection that focuses mostly on the political activities of Capitol Hill. During a White House reception for freshman congressmen in the Oval Office, Sock strolled through the event to which he was not invited, as cats do, and caught the eye of the photographer for one frame, circled. The photos we have from the Roll Call collection, taken for potential use in the Roll Call newspaper, date mostly from between 1988 and 2000. Few are digitized, but records exist describing the photos in the Prints and Photographs online catalog. Like many of the other collections I've mentioned throughout this presentation, the Roll Call collection is accessible to in-person researchers in the Prints and Photographs reading room. Its location indicated here by the arrow above the Madison building of the Library of Congress. I'm going to take questions after a few notes here, so please note that any question you have that you don't get to ask today or that you want to ask in the future, you can contact us through Ask a Librarian. And if you wish to receive a PDF version of today's talk, you can also use Ask a Librarian for that. You can also do some of your own searches within the Prints and Photographs online catalog, which contains over 1.5 million digital images. And one more thing, I hope you will join us next month for the next Finding Pictures talk, where we will celebrate 90 years of the Historic American Building Survey. And that will be on Wednesday, November 15th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern.